Okay, perfect. Before I start, I just mentioned that Broadsword and the Beast, the deluxe edition, is out on the 1st of September, I believe. I will put a pre-ordering link just below this video. Um, my first question is, why did Chrysalis appoint Keith Olsen as producer? And what was it about his method that just didn't appeal to you? And do you think Bob Ezrin would have been right for this project?
Well, Keith Olsen was someone who I guess was A, available, B, had a track record of producing memorable albums. If I'm not mistaken, it might have been Fleetwood Mac.
Yes.
Whoever it was, I think it was the kind of rock and roll lifestyle band who did a lot of chemical substances. So that seemed to be ingrained in his work ethic or lack of. It didn't fit in with our timetable or our schedule because I think he found us all very dull and pedantic. He also had a way of working which was just simply to record everything, all takes, all the instruments completely flat, not EQ'd, nothing like the way it was going to sound on the record. He didn't want to create a monitor mix that sounded in any way indicative of a shape of the song sonically, on the grounds that he would take all of this back to America and then work his magic on it. That wasn't my way of working. I like all the way along to be working and evolving an arrangement and to record things so that I can hear increasingly how the final mix is going to sound, because that way you have an opportunity to change the arrangement, do something a little different, if it's going to suit the song. Whereas his way of working was really to treat the musicians, I suppose, as if they were churning out spare parts in a factory and then to go and assemble it somewhere else in his own factory. So his method of working was not right for me, and plus the fact that he was frequently absent for a few minutes at a time during recording sessions. So we put up with it for about 4 or 5 days, and I said to the record company, "Look, you've got to get rid of this guy." I've no idea whether Keith Olsen is still alive or whether he's still working or what he does. Doubtless he'd have a different version of the story, but he wasn't the right guy for Jethro Tull, and Jethro Tull was not the right band for him to work with, because I'm sure he could have done a great job with a different bunch of musicians, but it wouldn't work with us. Bob Ezrin was somebody that I then approached, and I spoke. Actually, before I spoke to Bob Ezrin, I went. I think we were playing in somewhere in Germany, in some arena where Pink Floyd were on the night before us doing The Wall. Mm-hmm. And so I went to see the show and sought an audience with Roger something or other. What's his name? Who, sorry?
Roger Waters.
Oh, Roger Waters. Yes, that's correct. And so I talked to Roger Waters about Bob Ezrin, and he gave a pretty positive thumbs up on Bob Ezrin and his work. And so I got in touch with Bob Ezrin, and he seemed keen to do it, and sent him some demos and stuff, I think, to give him an idea of what we were working on. But then at the end of it all, he then said, "No, I'm sorry, I now can't come." I think it was some family matter, some illness or something that was he just couldn't spare the time to do it after all. So we were left with nobody. And I looked in the yellow pages for record producers, came up with basically hardly anybody at all, came up with Paul Samuel Smith, who I knew of as a bass player in the Yardbirds, but also, perhaps more importantly, that he'd worked with Cat Stevens, an artist who I greatly admired for his acoustic singer-songwriting music, and what seemed to me a very sympathetic you might argue, hands-off way of working. And Jerry Conway, who by then was playing drums with us, also gave a thumbs up to Paul Samwell-Smith being a very traditional, nice English gentleman who was easy to get on with and seemingly free of any kind of stimulant or relaxant problems. So he turned up, and we got on very well with Paul Samwell-Smith, who wasn't really kind of involved in the entire thing, but he came in at a point where what I was really looking for primarily is someone who would put the finishing touches and would obviate the need for me to sit in on every part of the process right to the bitter end, because it was quite stressful and working on on the writing songs, arranging songs, recording the stuff, and I really wanted someone who would then have an independent set of ears and an independent mind to make positive suggestions. And Paul Samwell-Smith was the right guy for the job, and he did a good job to do all of that. And I felt he worked well with all of the bands, particularly with our engineer Robin Black, and so that was an easy fit. It was everything that Keith Olsen was not.
Okay, I'm interested. You played the last show of the A Tour in France, February 1981. Was there any desire on your part to retain Mark Cranny and Eddie Jobson in the band? And what was it that about Jerry Conway that recommended him for this project?
Well, Eddie Jobson made it very clear from the word go that he was only there as a guest musician, not as a regular or permanent member of the band. It was special guest Eddie Jobson. And Mark Cranny, who was, I suppose, was already working with Eddie Jobson on some other project, hence Eddie suggested him, and he came into the fray. And Mark was a really, really nice guy who had a very natural technical skill and feel to his music, but he was quite a busy drummer, rather more in the vein of Barry Barlow. And I think what I was looking for was something a little straight ahead and solid, and something, very rhythmic, direct, and rhythmically accurate. And Jerry, again, perhaps because of that connection with Cat Stevens, I knew of Jerry's drumming, and he'd played with some other bands that were rather more folk oriented. Wasn't really a rock drummer at all, but someone who, I think really listened to the music and tried to find the choice phrases and embellishments that would be an understatement but would fit into the music, rather than being flashy and imposing themselves really on the actual song. So it was easier really with Jerry to embark upon those first demos, rehearsals, and then ultimately the recording. Mark was a great guy, but I don't think long term he was the right person to be with Jethro Tull. He also had two drawbacks. Number one, he was American, living in I think at that time in the Los Angeles area, and number two, that he suffered, as it turned out, from very severe problems, which meant he had to have kidney dialysis on a regular basis, and so he was not physically in good shape, and geographically he was not in good shape in the sense of being 5,000 miles away. So there you have it.
Well, Jerry Conway, wasn't there some issues with him playing the Classic Tull repertoire live?
Well, not in terms of technical ability. Jerry could work it all out and play it. It's just that Jerry didn't work from notes, and he didn't write music or have any way of using cue sheets to remind him of where he was. And obviously some of the arrangements are quite complex and with varied time signatures and elements which I think Jerry found quite difficult to remember. Not surprisingly, we all do, but we have to rehearse and practice it, and all the guys, can, apart from me, they can all write either detailed or at least rough arrangements down on a piece of paper when it comes to the learning process. And so Jerry was, having to rely very much on his memory, and playing a 2-hour show with a lot of complex music was sometimes, I mean, not that often, but occasionally, it was a little difficult for him, and there would be a train wreck. But, we had to laugh it off because Jerry was that kind of a guy. He was terrified when he made a mistake or got the wrong part to a song or something. You could see the terror in his eyes. And so, you had to just take it with a smile and say, there, Jerry, I'm sure it'll be better tomorrow night. And it was.
Yeah. Yeah. Was there a conscious effort after the A album to make Broadsword sound more Tull-like, down to the discarding of the jumpsuits for more medieval-looking garb? And do you think the A album alienated your core fan base?
No idea. It's back then. There was no social media to feed back anything from the fans, and I've never been one to hobnob with people in the music industry or indeed the fans. I like my own company. I tend to hide away, so there's no way in which I would have any of that kind of a feedback, really. And these days, with the plethora of social media to inform you as to every whim, dissatisfaction, and deep loathing that might be expressed in your general direction, then I guess I could find that out, but I don't use social media, so I don't in any way, again, have any direct feedback with any of those people who might like this or not like that. I can only judge really by more tangible evidence, like the Broadsword album did very well in Germany. Out of the box, it was the most successful Jethro Tull record in Germany ever. In Germany, arguably the joint second market in the world, really, for us. And in terms of record sales, big country, a lot of people listening to a lot of music. But in America, it did not do well at all. And that was in part to what was then the changing face of American AOR radio, FM radio, which had been during the 70s the launch pad for every rock band's new album, because that's where you got your record played, and the notable radio stations around the USA would play all of your album, every track, repeatedly. And that was obviously a huge influence on the members of the audience. And first of all, hearing there was a new album out, getting to hear actual songs and deciding whether or not to go and buy it. But all of that went through a total change when American radio decided that it had to move with the times and discard the classic rock format in favor of something that was called contemporary rock or alternative rock, both rather broad definitions or lack of definition, really, which just meant we're going to stop playing Jethro Tull and start playing Huey Lewis and the News and Billy Idol and that sort of stuff. Oh. So there was a complete sea change right across America. You have to remember that American radio was always consulting the few radio gurus who would come up with the playlists based on analysis as to what the audience would tune into, and the result from the advertisers who would place their product for paid slots on commercial radio. And so it was all becoming a detailed science, really, in terms of what should be played. And radio went along with it. They were falling prey to, I can't remember the name of them. There was one main man who was the big consultant to radio. They all fell for it, hook, line, and sinker, for a couple of years, until they realized that the advertisers were not happy because they weren't getting the revenue anymore, because alternative or, some modern approach to it was very often people who didn't have any money to spend. So, students at college or young hip people in their first job, didn't really have, they weren't turning out in droves to buy a new Pontiac from so and so's car dealership, or to go to some restaurant chain to buy a Sunday lunch for granny or whatever. It was suffering commercially, and so gradually America went back to classic rock, which is still today what all those stations play. But I could name certain stations that were big friends of Jethro Tull and everybody else up to a point, and then suddenly they abandoned us, and then they drifted back to it. And today, once again, you'll hear, well, at least 2 or 3 tracks of Jethro Tull being played regularly, because the playlists are incredibly narrow. It's just wallpaper music for people who know exactly what they want to hear and what's coming up next. So classic rock is very much the format again. That proves its worth in terms of creating advertising revenue for radio stations right across the country. But Broadsword fell into that deep void where suddenly it was not getting really any play at all on American radio. Wow. And so it consequently sold relatively few copies. But how it will fare in terms of a re-release and a big box set version will depend really, I suppose, on a finite number of fans who will decide they want to buy that because they want to complete their Jethro Tull collection or whatever it is. So maybe in America it will have a small but firm following and a degree of sales that make it all worthwhile for Warner Music to have gone to enormous trouble and time using all kinds of expertise to come up with a very good piece of product for Jethro Tull fans worldwide.
Do you think Falling on Hard Times is more pertinent today than it was in 1982?
Not really. I think it's just, frankly, the shift of, I mean, you could argue in the post-war years, we'd fallen on hard times. You could argue again that very much in the case of in the mid-70s, we were falling on hard times, and during that period of time, we were again falling on hard times in the 80s, falling in hard times certainly today in a post in a post-Brexit and a post-COVID context. We are struggling along with many other countries, and so it is a relatively timeless song, isn't it? In the sense of Aqualung being a timeless song, you could say there are more or less or a different demographic of homelessness in the world today compared to in the 60s or 70s, but nonetheless it still exists. It's still a relevant song because of the subject matter not going away, as indeed the subject matter of 99% or certainly 95% of all the great pop and rock songs ever is the timeless bleating about being in love or out of it, which makes up obviously the vast majority of song lyrics. It's timeless. It doesn't go away. Yeah. From Shakespeare's sonnets through to to the Tinseltown pop divas of today. It's all the same topic. Hardly anybody writes about real stuff.
Yeah.
Bruce Springsteen does. He's someone I'm not exactly a huge Bruce Springsteen fan because it's Americana and it's something that I feel is for me a little alien, even though I've been to America many, many times. But Bruce Springsteen, I have a huge respect and admiration for because he sings about real things, and he sings from the heart and from personal experience. It's observational, but you get the feeling that he has the authority to give it that personal touch, whereas I don't. I just make it up. I fake it.
Right. Do you think tracks like The Curse and Salamander Ragtime would place you in hot water if you wrote them today?
Well, it would certainly be placing me in the heart of some social media discussion, that's for sure. But again, there is nothing disrespectful to women. Indeed, both songs are actually very sympathetic and a little bit, if anything, critical of the typical selfish male response to menstruation. It's a bit inconvenient. It's a bit like global heating or it's a bit inconvenient, you know. No, I think they're both songs that I would argue are difficult things to write about, and if you do it with a light touch, not in a Frank Zappa-esque kind of cruel way. If you do it with a light touch, but with a degree of built-in sympathy, then I think it's okay. And as a topic to write about, it's obviously one that doesn't. I'm sure it's not the only song about menstruation, or the only two songs about menstruation ever to be written. But I certainly in a pretty small group, and I can't think of offhand of any other song that really talks about those things in such a way. So, you know, somebody's got to do that stuff.
Absolutely,
might as well be me.
Yeah. Interesting. When you revisited the what you waggishly dubbed the Chateau disaster tapes in 87, 88 for the 20th anniversary box set, did you feel that these recordings were much better than you remembered them from 1973? And do you think you were a bit hasty in abandoning all that material to re-record the album?
Well, they weren't. You know, they weren't. It wasn't the fault of the band. You know, the band was doing what they always did, which is to scratch their heads and think, what is he on about with this song he's just presented to us? But they did their best with it. It was sounding okay. It just wasn't sounding special. And I think ultimately I would have to take all the responsibility for them, largely being not just really very focused or great songs. The ideas were kind of okay, and some of them did spin off into later work in the next couple of albums. So it wasn't all lost. It was just much of it was a little quaint, a little overly delicate, maybe, in the way that it talked about certain things. So no, definitely just not my best work. That's all. But listening to it again, I would have been perfectly happy to leave it in a bottom drawer somewhere. But it was at that time when I suppose you could gauge the appetite as it was being fed back to me from the record companies, that they really did want to have everything that had ever been recorded, good or bad. It's something that I have a little difficulty with, but you know, if it's not too terrible, then it can have its momentary place in the sun, or at least in a half cloudy sky. And in the case of the Chateau disaster tapes, I mean, I dug them all out, I mixed them, and I did what I could to make them sound sort of vaguely credible. But you know, it was a job of work that I think I resolved I didn't really want to do again. Hence, with all the stuff that were the demos and the initial recordings of the Broadsword material, I was very happy to leave that to Stephen Wilson to wrestle with, rather than do it myself.
Oh,
I mean, maybe it's just laziness, but I do feel that after such an enormous passage of time, you know, fresh ears are a very good thing to have.
Yeah. Speaking of which, of course, Stephen Wilson's been doing a wonderful job in these deluxe sets. I wonder if I could prod you to reveal what you think an Underwraps deluxe set might look like, and do you have any stuff tucked under your bed that might make its way into such a set?
No, we recorded, as I remember, 15 songs, which were, I think all 15 of them made it onto
Reassure
cassette. They made it onto cassette at the time. But of course, on a vinyl album, you had to pick and choose carefully to get even 10 or 12 songs that would fit the constraints of a single vinyl album. And my memory of the time was that there are no additional recordings. That there were 15 songs recorded, and that's it. If it was 15, maybe it was 14, but whatever it was everything that was finally released as part of that package is all there was. There are no demos, no nothing else. It was all done. I mean, it was all performed live in the studio to a sync track and a click and a drum machine. So it was all in terms of the band playing stuff, you know, we were all playing in the studio for real. It was just that it's, at the time, I suppose, I'd become fairly adept at the technology of the day in programmable drum machines, if we call them that, and so I knew what I wanted to hear in terms of arrangement and parts. But sonically, of course, it was limited to the technology, which was very poor. And so in today's world, it was probably the equivalent of about 4-bit audio. So it was very, very poor quality. Bass drums sounded a bit sort of plip-ploppy, and snare drums sounded a bit, lifeless and had no dynamics and none of the human touch that you could use today in much more sophisticated computerized drum technology. But I always said if we were going to do anything with Underwraps, it has to be with a real drummer. And I've had that conversation on and off over the last couple of years with Warner Music, who basically, I think, are in a quandary. Is it worth spending what would be quite a lot of money to have a good new drum track put into place, as well as all the work on presenting it in a package and justifying that it was something that people should now listen to if they didn't listen to it before? It's a quite a commercial risk for them to do that, and so I'm waiting for a response. Basically, they did come back with some sort of part solution. I said that's not a solution. That's just digging us into a deeper hole of automated drums. So it's got to be a real drummer playing in real time. And I have a couple of suggestions of people who I think would be happy to do it, but I'm still waiting for them to decide whether economically it is worth the effort.
Okay. Crest of a Knave is the quintessential Tull album. Am I wrong?
No, I think you're wrong. I mean, Crest of a Knave did well in the USA, much better than it did perhaps in the UK, because it did have a few songs that maybe just lent themselves to that re-emergence of attention that we were beginning to get on radio. But more importantly, at that point, it was the genesis of MTV and its enormous influence with videos. And so we did a video of Steel Monkey. We did one of another song, can't remember what it was, but we were, because MTV was so desperate for video material for programming, they would play anything, even Jethro Tull. And so we found ourselves alongside the Huey Lewises and the Billy Idols and whoever else, being played on MTV just for a short space of time, because once everybody realized they had to bring out videos and how important MTV was becoming, then they had so much to choose from that they were subsequently not interested in Jethro Tull at all, which is fair enough. But the album did very well in the USA, being a certified gold album. And if I'm not mistaken, I think it got to I'm trying to. I don't really follow chart position, but it probably did very well in the album charts, and subsequently, of course, it was the subject of the dishonorable Grammy Award.
That's right.
So all of that, it's part of the backstory to an album that, again, suffered from not enough live drums. Pretty good songs and some of them were songs that I'm very happy to play today. In fact, Farm on the Freeway from the Crest of a Knave album is in the set next week because we're in the USA.
Yeah.
But, it's not in the set, or hasn't been in the set in the last, I don't know how long, in the UK anyway. So it really just depends. To some extent, you're always having to look, what did I play last time I was in town? So I have to go back and look through all the historic set lists and say, okay, no, I did that one there, and I'm here again 2 years later. So maybe I need to, try and play substantially different material. And so it's always a juggling act trying to find the right songs for any given tour.